Jim. Thank you very, very much. You did a great job today. I cannot begin to thank you enough for letting me be with you today. This is quite an honor. You see, I'm a customer, and I thought I would kind of start out what we're going to discuss today a little bit, mentioning that comment. What I mean by I'm a customer is that I need the peer review. I am a CPA, but I've not done audits. And I've relied on the peer review process in order to make sure that the auditors that were working with us and in conjunction with us were in fact capable of doing it. And in the time I've had an opportunity to be a United States Marine, what I thought I'd just somewhat do is go over a little bit about what it means to be in the military. So do we have any other veterans in the group? So thank you for your service. I really mean that. Thank you so much. We took an oath of office, and when we took an oath of office in the military, the oath goes something like this, and if this is the way I used to handle recruiting command in the Marine Corps. I really wasn't in, but it gave me a great idea. If you all join with me, you're all back in the United States Marine Corps, and I can make my quota. Anybody ready to join? No. It says, I, Francis X. Ryan, do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I'm about to enter, so help me God. And I mention that for a reason, is because little did I know that a few years after I got out of the Marine Corps, I was taking a different type of oath of office as a CPA, and many of the people in this room who are either regulators or CPAs are doing the same thing. We have a responsibility to take care of the public. I noticed something when I walked across the United States. I met an awful lot of homeless people. And as I did, I found that many of the people that I presumed were homeless, might have been homeless for a reason different than what I thought, but I found about 50 to 60% of people were individuals who were professionals or had something go wrong in 08 and 09 and didn't handle it well. And what one young man told me one time who was homeless, he said, Frank, we're all just one paycheck away from being homeless. And by the time I got done walking, I had a new appreciation for that. And so I saw the economic casualties of 2008 and 2009 a little bit differently than I had before I started to walk. In fact, we're writing a book about those experiences in which we're talking about what the leadership lessons I learned when I was walking across the United States. But as I did, what I found out was they're in the profession. And as I sit back, and I was in Jim's session as soon as I got here today, and Jim, you did a phenomenal job. You really did. Didn't he do a great job, those that were in the program? Did a really good job. He really handled himself well, and the questions that were asked were absolutely brilliant. But what's happened is that the public has come to rely on us. And we have a standard of responsibility. And that standard of responsibility is embodied in the Code of Ethics of being a CPA. And it says that we have the responsibility for integrity, objectivity, integrity, due care, and attuned to broad-based business knowledge. But as my wife would say when she would hear me saying something like that, she'd go, blah, 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 right? By the way, I was leaving the house this morning. As I was walking out, I changed clothes after I got here. And as I was walking out of the house this morning, she looked at me, she said, you're not really going to wear that, are you? Well, what's that mean? This was 4 o'clock in the morning. That means you're going to go back in and sit down, and she's going to pick out an outfit for me. So while I could walk across the United States and command a large Marine unit, apparently I can't dress myself. And so all 3 dogs were sitting next to me like, thanks for waking me up, old man, right? So it reminded me when I was younger, this had happened. I was walking outside. My wife said the same thing. So I went in. My son Walter was 4 years old, and he was sitting on the bed. And as I walked in, he looked at me. He said, Daddy, Mommy's going to help me get dressed. And I said, yeah, me too. Right? So it was one of those great things. So as you do that, you recognize we have to work together, be it in terms of either an outfit so it doesn't clash, or in terms of our profession, our objectivity, and our standards. But those words mean something. Those words of integrity mean a tremendous amount. That's what our profession stands for. And when we have someone who does something that's inappropriate, people get hurt. You know, when I'm a young Marine, or I'm a young officer, a young soldier, sailor, airman, or Coast Guardsman, I have that same responsibility. I used to tell people when we got called up shortly after September 11, 2001, I got all of my my officers, and I had a joint unit, soldiers and Marines predominantly, but I did have some airmen and Coast Guardsmen and also sailors as well. I make comments along the lines that your families gave their children to us, they rented them to us, they want them back. And that if we do something stupid, people get hurt. In much the same way, we have economic casualties that took place in 2008 and 2009. The landscape is littered with the number of communities that had housing starts fail. We heard terms like no doc loans. Remember those wonderful days? If we were professionally skeptical, which our profession requires us to be, should maybe we have said something? And many people in the profession did. And as you start to look at this, where the PROC can help us, and the great work that Janice and Jim have done in setting this up, you set a standard. You've said that this responsibility means something. And the integrity principle really requires us to full and faithfully represent the duties of the profession we're about to enter. That sounds really similar to the oath of office in the United States military. And when you see the effects on someone whose home is underwater, when you see the effects on someone who's had their life savings wiped out, if they had been with God bless you, with WorldCom or Enron, when you see someone whose life has been upended because of something over which they had no control, you get a different perspective of how valuable it is what you're doing. I call you the Marine, and I hope this doesn't offend anybody, I call you the Marine Corps of the profession, the CPA profession. You're the ones that are the guardians of the public trust. Think about that responsibility for a second. When I was walking across the United States, I was absolutely amazed at the number of abandoned towns I walked through. I was stunned, over 50. I was absolutely impressed that in 140 days of walking across the United States, I did not have one bad experience, not one. I was walking outside of San Diego, and I'd already gone about 75, 80 miles, and I'd left Pennsylvania, although I'm with Maryland Association CPAs and the PICPA. I currently live in Pennsylvania. I went from 30-degree and 20-degree temperatures and about 60 inches of snow to San Diego, where it was not that, if you pick up the drift. It was like 85 degrees, and within 4 days I'm in the desert, and it was almost 100. And so I was walking outside of San Diego on my way up to Julian, California. So I was up at about 4,000 feet, and a California patrol officer pulls me over, and he said, "Sir, you doing okay?" Because apparently I didn't look so good, I guess. And if you use that as a standard, people would always be asking me how I'm doing. But what happened is, as I'm starting to walk, he said, "You're doing all right." I said, "Fine." And he said, "Can I ask you what you're doing?" I said, "Yes, sir, I'm walking across the United States." And he gave me a great big bear hug. He said, "Congratulations, you're almost done." I said, "Sir, I'm walking to Ocean City, Maryland." So he comes back and he says, he almost had tears in his eyes. He said, "I'm so sorry." And he went back and he got me some water, and he probably got me some Band-Aids, and he probably should have given me some alcohol at that point, but I don't drink. But what happened was I was surprised by the absolute compassion of everyone I saw. You have that same compassion when you uphold our standards. As a customer, I have to tell you, I'm an audit committee chair of a lot of organizations. And there's an individual in this room that I won't embarrass, but he deserves to be honored. Because what he did for our organization is he saved it. His firm had the character and capabilities to help identify some issues with us that saved us. And candidly, I'm unbelievably honored to say he's a friend, and to say that the people in the regulatory process, we had people from the department, I have to be careful, because if I tell you the departments, then you'll know who it was. Some of the different groups that I was dealing with were the regulators, who were very helpful in the process as well. Nobody's sitting there trying to see us fail. Janice and I were talking about that earlier today. No one is sitting there trying to see someone fail. We're trying to collaboratively work together to make sure that this system works for the benefit of the public. People who are hoping that we do the right thing are sitting back trying to ensure and understand, are we doing the right thing? Do we have the professional capabilities? And are we looking at that oversight? And having a regulatory body overlook at it. Some people, and earlier in my career, I probably would have sat back and said, yeah, I wish that didn't happen. But now I look at it in terms of after spending 4 years on an ethics committee, the last 12 months as the ethics committee chair of the Pennsylvania Institute of CPAs, I recognize that if we're doing this thing right, we can work together, not for the purpose of punishing, but instead for the purpose of providing a better service to our communities. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm an expert in economic warfare. I've been in 7 nations in my life that have collapsed. I've seen things in this very long lifetime that in many cases I wish I hadn't seen. You see a lot of turmoil. I saw situations in Romania where they went into a massive deflationary cycle and pay scales dropped 95% in less than 2 weeks. We have a challenging time ahead of us in this world. We do. Does anybody agree with me on that? Whenever you have a situation when you heard in 2000, we're in a new economy, earnings no longer matter, CPAs were raising the professional skeptical view. A number of people raised that concern. And in 2007, we heard comments like no-doc loans. I became an interim CFO of a publicly traded bank. And in conjunction with a great set of auditors and regulators, it did well, and things worked out well. It's because we worked together and we wanted it to work. But it's when people in our profession decide that they don't want it to work, we need you as well. We need you to have that intestinal fortitude, even when it's not comfortable, to sit back and say, we're going to do what we need to do to ensure that the public trust is maintained. We have a responsibility in our profession for objectivity. That means to be impartial, intellectually honest, and free of conflicts of interest. And when you look at that, that's a tough standard. That means you can't bring your own bias into it, and that's hard to do. Yeah, I often make a joking comment, and we'll do it right now if you're interested. What color is a stop sign? Red. What color is a yield sign? It's red. The reason I mention it is because it used to be yellow. And I had one person say, I knew it, 1937. It changed. But why do we call it yellow? Why do we think of it being yellow? It's because what caution is. And the only reason for doing that is to give a visual reminder of what happens when you go into something with a preconceived notion. And what happens is if everyone starts, I use an expression calling drinking the Kool-Aid. Jim gave me a new expression that I'm going to use going forward that I'm going to start writing into all my ethics programs. But as you start to examine it, it gives us a good opportunity to recognize that if we all start believing the same thing, we'll become incredibly vulnerable to what's happening. So let me give you an example. China recently, in the past 72 hours, announced that certain groups cannot sell shares because the stock market has already dropped 30%. Does that concern anybody? What do you think? It should. Because that basically means there's not a free flow of the market. So when you remove that stop, look at what happens. If you go back into the 1970s, I used to say in the 70s, but I had one person look at me one time and said, 1970s? Thank you. Yes, the 1970s. I'm getting a little sensitive about the age issue. I was going through TSA this morning. He said, sir, at your age, you don't need to take your shoes off. I said, what's the age cutoff? He said, 75. I'm 64. So apparently things are not going as well as I would like them to go. So this might be the indicator, proof positive, you don't want to walk across the United States. That was the other thing that scared me just a little bit. I was able to fly in an hour and a half when it took me 100 days to walk. That scared me just a tiny bit. But we won't go there either. But as you start to take a look at this issue and you recognize some of the challenges that we face, where are we challenging and questioning the status quo? That's what we need the peer review oversight committee to do. You are the and I'm going to use a fairly important word in my mind. You're the ultimate line of defense. You're that quality control that keeps this glue together. You are what I need to ensure that the people that are doing the audit have the capabilities of pulling this off, and so that the peer reviewers are in fact qualified. But if they're not, I have a huge problem, and I won't even know it until it explodes on us. And when it explodes on us, the people it's going to hurt are our employees and our families and anyone else that happens to be a member of the public. The public's got a right to expect that. And that objectivity is something that's a very powerful and incredibly important concept. Impartial, intellectually honest, and free of conflicts of interest. When you examine those words, you have to look at it differently. I'm on the board of directors of a hospital system. And I remember getting a phone call from our president at the time. And she said, I was chairman of the audit committee. She said, Frank, we want to do something different. And I said, well, this was well before the Affordable Care Act was passed. And she said, Frank, health care the way it's being done now won't work. We need to do it differently. I'm going to propose that we tear down the hospital and start all over again. Now, as a CPA, all I keep thinking about is this is a $125 million building you want me to tear down? And she said, it won't work if we keep doing it the way we've done it in the past. Through her great vision, the city of Baltimore is now continuing to benefit from some of the work she's done. And she's since been promoted and has done a great job. She's a visionary. She was willing to break the status quo. When Janice and others in Texas and Mississippi, when you decided to set up a framework for a peer review oversight committee, you broke the standard. When the AICPA developed the peer review process, what a brilliant idea. This idea emanated in the 1960s. And when you think about the way it's evolved, it was an effort from members in the profession to say, we've got to be able to ensure that consistency. And I applaud all of you that are in this room that are in the regulatory side that are either have set one up or are thinking about it, because I, as a customer, need you. Without you, I don't have any confidence that not the process, that I'm qualified to determine if this system's working the way it is. You're an integral part of the control environment, which is part of the COSO standards, Committee on Sponsored Organizations, which if you realize when that came about, it was in the 1970s when the first concept of COSO has come out. It's been revitalized in 2013 to recognize how important it is, that control environment. That's the tone at the top. You are the tone at the top. We have a lot of people in this room that helped start that process, and I applaud you for having done that. Because when you did it, you basically said, we're not going to sit back and accept the status quo. So let me tell you how I use the peer review process. I'm on a lot of audit committees. I'm chair of a number of them. When I'm selecting the CPA firm, I get the peer review report. If I have a concern about the company's proposal, then I'm going to sit down and challenge it. Because one thing I want you to be aware of is if you think that the process on the audit committee isn't getting better, let me assure you it is. Those of us on audit committees now realize that we blew it. We needed to fix things. We did not always hold our standards the way that we should have, and we learned that lesson. We learned it the hard way, but unfortunately, we were not always the ones who paid the price. The people that paid the price were those poor economic victims of that warfare. They were the economic casualties of war. And if you don't think that's not as destructive to their families as someone who has lost someone in combat, and I've seen both, I've made a casualty call, and if there's anything else I ever have to do in my life, I hope I never have to do that again. But I had that same feeling when I had to lay off a father and a mother of 4 children when they didn't know how they were going to make their mortgage payment. They're different, but they're incredibly identical. This responsibility that's been given to you and it's been established in this peer review process is a sacred trust that people have come to expect. So when I look at this peer review, I'm looking at this report. So I was mentioning to, again, someone here, a very dear friend from Maryland. I was explaining some of the issues that I was running into, and I said I got 5 proposals, one from the incumbent and 4 others, and the one from the incumbent was higher than the other 4. And I called the other 4 together with the entire audit committee, and we said, we're not convinced you can do the audit for this amount of money. That caused me concern, because here's the concern for me. I have a responsibility to my public as well. as a chair of an audit committee or a member of an audit committee. People get hurt if I'm not doing my job. I'm a firm believer that a great deal of what happened in 2007 and 8 is because boards of directors weren't paying attention. So I had contacted a major university about setting up a corporate governance training program. NACD has got a great one, COSO does, but this was designed for smaller entities. I got nowhere until the day after the organization had a major issue themselves. Then I got a phone call saying, we'd like to set it up. What they recognize is that a good and well-functioning board is incredibly essential to the success of a company. And I'm going to say the same thing to you. A well-functioning peer review oversight is absolutely essential to maintain the integrity of the system. And I can't emphasize that enough. If you take your responsibilities lightly, that means I'm relying on something that may not be accurate. And so as a result, I'm looking at these proposals. We got the 4 firms together. We said, please take a look at your proposals. We're going to tell you everything we need to know. And they came back and some of them revised the proposal, some of them they did not. We are well beyond, in the audit committees, we are well beyond the days of picking the cheapest. One of the individuals, one of the firms that's in this room today, saved our entity. We would not be around today if it had not been for them. And I have to explain to you, when I first met them, I didn't know much about their firm. I'd heard them, but I'd not done them. And I'd gotten a proposal, and their proposal was in such extraordinary detail. Out of 5 or 6 firms I was interviewing, one, they had the peer review report there, but out of the 5 or 6 firms I was interviewing, this firm's detail was absolutely unbelievable in the level of detail and the quality of the proposal. And so I decided, even though they didn't make my short list to bring them in for the interview, we selected them for the audit. And I was honored that they did. At the same time, they did something that taught me a very valuable lesson. They did a background check on me, and they still were willing to do the audit. Can you believe that? No, anyway, I'm sorry, just a little humor. But what happened was they did, and I was impressed by that. But their comment was, if we can't trust the tone at the top, we don't want to be involved. Think about that. What they were basically saying, the revenue was not as important to them as it was the understanding of the quality of the working relationship. I was doing a situation where we had required communications from our auditors. And as I was explaining the required communications to different people in the process, one of the issues that came about was this specific concept of understanding who's responsible for what. And as we get involved in it, we start understanding what our responsibilities are, so the auditors tell us what they're required to do. And usually, if you talk to anybody who's been on an audit committee, has anybody here been on an audit committee? Maybe. Would you agree most of the times it was a one-way street historically? Not anymore, is it? It's not. And so what happened was they had a new partner and they wanted to have this person listen in just to get an idea. This was a different firm. And so they did, and we went half an hour, for the required communications. And then they said, do you have any input you want to bring up? And the audit committee was so involved, we listed areas where we had concerns about the controls, about whether or not they could be circumvented or there were unintended consequences. That only came about because I had the distinct opportunity of getting a great background in education from the first CPA firm I had met, who had prepared a tremendously decent proposal that helped me understand all of my responsibilities in the process. We used to always ask a question at the audit committee meetings: is your fee sufficient in order for you to complete the audit, right? And the comment was, it said, you have to understand, it's not the fee. The audit will be done. If we lose money on the process, that's our responsibility, not yours. We'll discuss it the following year, but that's our responsibility. And if we've done anything inappropriate, by the way, obviously that's a separate discussion. But that's the level of cooperation that's involved. When I get the peer review report, I can look at it and have some degree of confidence. I'm going to make a comment to you that the way I can now believe in peer reviews is significantly better than it was 10 years ago. It's gotten better. I have to tell you, most of the firms that we've seen the peer review reports of have been pretty substantially well documented and well done. Is that a guarantee? No, you can't eliminate an ethics issue. Janice and I were talking about that earlier today. You can't convince someone, if they're going to lie to you, you can't stop them from doing it. You can see, does it make sense? Have you subordinated your judgment? And what that means is, have you willingly overlooked something that's significant? We have a lot of crises going on right now, as an example. We have China, Greece, Puerto Rico. Obviously, what happened with the Illinois Supreme Court could have a significant negative effect on Chicago. And you look at many of the municipal problems that we're dealing with today, we need you more than ever. And so as you start to examine those issues of the objectivity, to be intellectually honest with each other, it means that we have to sit back and say, what can we do to improve the art of accounting? Many people are not aware that as a CPA, we have a responsibility to maintain the orderly functioning of commerce. It's in our ethics standards, which means that we have to be attuned to broad-based business knowledge. I spent a lot of time in the Marine Corps. I was recalled active duty out of retirement in 2004 when I got a phone call and it says, Colonel Ryan, you've been recalled active duty. And I said, you don't understand, I'm retired. And they said, you don't understand, you're leaving tomorrow. And they won. Who knew? I didn't know that. So whenever I got over to Iraq, by the way, it was a very dry heat, 130 degrees. It was really nice. It was pretty nice. But what happened was, as you're sitting there, occasionally a young person would come in and say, Colonel, I don't know why they want me to report to you, but they told me I'm supposed to see you, but I'm not supposed to be here. And as soon as they would say that, I'd say, I got it. I said, sit down. He said, sir, he said, this is a mistake. I'm not supposed to be in Iraq. And I said, yeah. I said, I'm in the same boat. And so he says, what do you mean? He said, sir, I'm out of the military. I said, what kind of uniform are you wearing right now? And so what happened is they didn't know that they had a commitment after they left active duty. And if you didn't resign your commission, you were back on duty. And so it was a great place. Now, I've often said, incidentally, just as a segue, if you don't mind, that if I were ever elected president, I was thinking that we should attack the Caribbean. Could you imagine how easy it would be to recruit? Ladies and gentlemen, next week we're going to do Aruba. The week after that, Cancun. We'll get a whole bunch of different places in the process. But apparently that's why I'll never be elected. But what happens as you start to examine all these different issues that happen, you want to recognize that their lives were turned upside down overnight. In much the same way it happens in organizations if the companies don't do well. The recession in 2008 and 2009 was pretty significant. In the 7 nations that I've been in my entire career, it was more significant than that. We saw people who lost everything. I was in a program in Virginia Beach yesterday for the Virginia Society of CPAs, and one young lady was there from Poland, and my daughter-in-law was an emigre from Poland, and she and my son live in Pittsburgh, and her name was Anna. And Anna made the comment, and I said, could you talk to people what it was like when your nation collapsed? She said, well, my family, my parents lost all of their pensions. They evaporated. Everything evaporated. The country no longer existed. It became a new nation. We have a lot of instability. You and I, our profession, the great work that Jim and Janice and others have done in the profession, Texas, Mississippi, my own association, MACPA, other state societies that do a lot of work in Oklahoma. I lecture in pretty much all 50 states. And what happens is that my 10-minute warning? No. That was a good warning system, by the way. How many of you would like that to be my 10-minute warning? I often tell people my job's to talk to you for 55 minutes about this topic. Your job's to listen. Please raise your hand if you get done before I do. And that happens pretty regularly, so I got to be careful. But what happens is you start to examine these different issues, you start to see where is it that something could go wrong? What do we need to do to fix these things and provide ourselves as the guardians for the public trust? So when you ask yourself the couple of the standards, integrity and objectivity, due care is professionalism. That's where you all are coming into play. The peer review oversight committees and that entire process is making sure that people are exercising the professionalism in an area of widely changing professional standards. So as you start to examine that widely changing professional standards, it gives us the opportunity to tie the profession together with the regulatory bodies to protect the public. As CPAs, we recognize that responsibility. As regulators, you recognize that responsibility. Because by doing that, we're protecting the sacred trust. What we're doing is saying, let's take our technical expertise and your regulatory responsibilities to see if we can come together with a great solution to understand who our responsibilities is to the public. I mentioned this in many of my ethics classes to students. I'll say, please remember who the public is. It's everyone. And I had one person make a comment. He said, well, I'm in a privately held company. We have no bank debt, so I don't have to worry about the public. Yeah, you do. The public is your creditors, your employees, anyone who else might be deceived by your actions. And so this issue of due care means we have to stay up to date on professional standards. Independence. The public's got a right to expect that we will be independent, even in industry. Our independent standard in industry is a little bit different, but as a result of a new ethics standard put out by the AICPA in conjunction with the state societies of CPAs, we have an entire section now for CPAs in industry. And so as we tighten that responsibility up on the industry side, and we try to embody and embolden the peer review oversight process, and we have already understood that the public accountants have always recognized their responsibilities, and occasionally we had to take action to bring people in line, but most people stayed in line. As I saw when I walked across the United States, most people stayed in line. So as you start to examine us pulling all this together, we're starting to come up with a very tight-knit package of all of us working together. If you're not aware, there's a new ethics standard for CPAs in industry, some of which went into effect on December 15, 2014, and some of which goes into effect on December 15, 2015. And when that does, it's 20 separate pages, and it's basically putting the burden of responsibility on us as well, but I'm going to call it the honor of that responsibility as well. Because few people have the opportunity to serve in the military, and few people have the opportunity and to serve in a regulatory capacity and in a CPA profession to make this a better economy, to make this a better world, to help embolden and strengthen the future of so many people. And embodied in all of that is this concept of trust. And when you look at this idea of trust, people in society have to know that they can trust. If they ever lose trust, is it hard to get trust once it's lost? I see the grimace. Is it very hard? Is it impossible? Usually, right? Let me make a comment to you. I had a good friend of mine, had a major malfunction at work. Well, he owned the company, and I became his consultant because of what happened. Got all the employees together. There was a room about this size, and he said, look, I've really screwed up royally. It was an ethics issue. I did something really stupid. The bank's not happy. They've given us a forbearance agreement. I'm not going to cut anybody's salary, but I'm going to drop my salary down by 80%. But I've got to ask you to please watch your spending, because if we don't, I may have to come back to you to ask for help. How do you think his staff related to him when he took full responsibility for what happened? Pretty well, right? It took about 3 years to get the company back on its feet, and it's now doing incredibly well. And about 2 years ago, he called me up. This had happened 10 years ago. About 2 years ago, he called me back and he said, I'm really angry. Now, I had not been a consultant for him for a long time, but we were friends. I said, what's wrong? He said, just get down here. I said, I live 2 hours away. He said, just get down here. I said, look, why don't we do this over the phone? He said, I'm taking you out to lunch. And he said, look, he said, I'll pay you portal to portal. And I said, I'll be right there. No, I didn't do that. I said, really? Can I double bill? No, I didn't say that. But what happened was I said, let's take a look at it. I said, I'll be down, because he was really upset. He gets back in. We're sitting down and we're talking to him. And here's what happened. He said, look, we had a bad quarter and the bank's monitoring us. I said, we're all right, but the bank's monitoring us. He said, without a doubt, every person in the company that was there 10 years ago said, did you do it again? And he said, if they think I'm going to pay for this the rest of my life, they're wrong. And I just looked at him and I said, if you don't think you're going to pay for this the rest of your life, you're sadly mistaken. The minute you decided to cross that line the first time, you have forever given up the right to do that. If you go into Google and type in Frank Ryan stupid mistakes, it's 2.8 million hits. And that's about most of them, as my son would admit and tell me about. But I mention that because that's what happens, and you have to own up to it and accept it. So losing trust is a major problem. If people lose trust in the peer review oversight process, we're in trouble. I'm relying on that. That's a key element for me. I can't survive if this isn't working with you working with me. I don't have an auditing background. So as I'm sitting there and I'm looking at these issues, and the work that I did in order to get my CPA was done at a very, very low level. I certainly have never organized an audit. I've been audited many times. I'm on 7 audit committees, and 2 of which have been on publicly traded companies. So I've seen the scrutiny that's required. But you have helped me working in collaboration on the audit side to help it. But that only works if I know that there's someone else at either the AICPA or NASBA that's working in close conjunction with you to ensure that the standards that you're adhering to are consistent in the United States. And that's a concern, because if they're not consistent in the United States, we are only as strong as the weakest link. You know, I don't know where the economy's going to go. I really don't. But I have to tell you, I'm cautious. I have a concern about where certain things can go. We need this process more than we've ever needed. We've needed a peer review oversight process. As you start looking at getting this embodied in public law, as you start doing that, you want to make sure you keep it flexible enough to be able to get things changed, and I'll explain why. For those of you who don't know, I ran for Congress in 2010, which means I lost the election, but that's another matter. These voters, they're so pesky. I think the thing that hurt the most is my son Walter started a Citizens Against Ryan campaign. I think that probably hurt the most. But as you start to examine these issues, I said to him, by the way, I said, I just want you to know they're going to say some stuff about your dad. And he said, Dad, don't give it a thought. There's nothing that they could say that I haven't thought. Yeah, it scared me just a little bit. Then he asked me for tuition money. I don't know what that was about. But as you start to examine this issue about where we are and what things are doing, I learned quickly in the legislative process, if you embody things too much in law, it makes it difficult to change it if something happens. So I would encourage you with NASBA and the Peer Review Oversight Committee to recognize those responsibilities, because if you fall behind the 8 ball in the regulatory process with what we need, it undermines the ability to support us in the way we need it. I'm on a lot of not-for-profit boards. And one of the reasons I decided to walk across the United States was I had an understanding at the time that the way we were treating children with emotional behavioral problems may not have been as effective as we wanted. I was told by a major agency that basically said, due to funding shortfalls, all the children must be taken care of inside of 6 months. Well, if you know someone with autism, that doesn't go away in 6 months. And I said, you know what, we have to sit back and be professionally skeptical and come up with a great way to fix this problem as we dealt with what we did. And when I was walking across the United States, I ran into some headwinds. From the period of time I went into Santa Rosa, New Mexico, until I walked all the way through the panhandle of Texas and in Dalhart, Texas, Guyman, Oklahoma, into Liberal, Kansas, over into Greensburg and into Buckland, I ran into some pretty significant headwinds. And I'll give you an example of what it is. As you show the headwinds, do you want to show the headwinds on that? Sorry about that. We had a cue and I missed the cue.
I'm only yelling so that you can hear me above the wind. Unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable.
And as you see those ones, they were 50-mile-an-hour headwinds for 7 days. And as you did it, we're running into headwinds as well, because you're going to be people that don't want to be regulated. But it's beneficial for the entire public that happens. It's a good thing that's being done. As long as we're doing this from a collaborative perspective, it makes a tremendous amount of sense. We can overcome those headwinds and make great progress. Well, after doing that for 7 days, we had about a 1-day break in the winds, and they kicked back up again. And what I have to explain to you, is anybody here from New Mexico? No? Anyone? I had an unfortunate accident in the outside of one of the towns in New Mexico. I was going through a lava field, and I did something to my ankle. So I went to University of New Mexico, and I walked there, and they put it in a leg brace. So the next 800 miles of my walk across the United States was called the Limp Across America. And after going through the better part of 14 days of that with 1 day of respite, I was about ready to quit. I just gotten to a point and said, I'm done. I'm not going to make this. I had gone 1,500 miles by that point in time. I had some fairly significant blister issues, and as a Marine, I thought I would never admit that, but I guess I did, in different parts of the process. And as I was getting outside of Greensburg, Kansas, I saw something. And if you know anyone from Kansas, it was a town that was destroyed by EF5 tornado in 2007. And I was walking by, I met a young girl and an older woman who had been in the town when it happened, and we just struck up a conversation. And this was the epitome of the attitude I saw when I was walking. I said to the young girl, I said, how old were you when this happened? She said, I was 9 years old. She said, a young girl had just moved into the neighborhood the week before, and I was over at her house when it hit. It hit in the evening. She said, it completely destroyed our house. And I said, wow, that must have been scary. She said, yeah, I was very worried about how my mom and dad were going to feel because they didn't know that I was safe. When you've got a young lady at 9 years old, now 16, who's thinking that way, our nation's in pretty good hands. So I'm pumped up by that a little bit, and I'm outside of Buckland, Kansas. And at this point, I'm writing the book. I now realize that what had happened was I hadn't eaten for 2 days. And I often tell people I lost 27 pounds when I was walking. I lost it in the first 3 weeks. And you're not going to believe this, but all the weight that I lost in California, Arizona, and New Mexico was able to find me back in Pennsylvania a year later. Can you believe that? It's unbelievable. And it came back to the same place. It was unbelievable. So it's great. Apparently, Krispy Kreme donuts helps. But what happens, that's why I'm telling everybody, the candy in there, that's a health food. But as you start to examine what happened, I'm outside of Buckland, Kansas, and I'm exhausted. And at that point in time, I mentally decided I'm done. And I was beat. I was really beat. So I sit down, and there's 3 farmers in there with their families and a young gal, 18-year-old waitress. She struck up a conversation. She said, what are you doing? And then all the farmers started asking me questions. They were very cordial. I had my breakfast, and she comes up and she puts her hand on my shoulder, and she just looks at me and she just says, you're probably thinking of quitting. She said, but people have quit on these children their entire lives. Don't you be one of them. And then she had a real nice note on the receipt. And then I went out and started walking again. And I'm going to say the same thing to you guys. When you're sitting there looking at the regulatory process, you're looking at all these issues, there are going to be some people that aren't happy about getting peer reviewed. There are going to be some people who aren't happy about some of their legislative and requirements that need to be done. But I can tell you one thing as you do it, and we're going to show you something in the Marine Corps. If you put the Iwo Jima Memorial up, you see a whole bunch of people that raised the flag, and the soldiers that did similar things in other theaters. They worked together. 2 branches of service here. It was a telltale sign of a lot of people that climbed a hill to raise a flag so that people could remain free. And I'm going to say the same thing to you. We all need together, people in public practice, people in industry, the regulators. We need to join together and replant that stable level of operations in our nation so that those young men and women that are trying to earn a living in our society can do so knowing that someone out there is looking after them to maintain and ensure that there's an orderly function of commerce. You guys have been great, and thank you for letting me be here. And any questions? I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Do I have a couple minutes or no?
Yeah.